Hello, this is Mrs. Sparry, and welcome to the tutorial on the poem Poppies by Jane Weir. This poem is featured in the Power and Conflict poetry cluster of the AQA GCSE English Literature course, and if you do have your anthologies with you, it'd be a fab idea to have it open to the page that features this particular poem. As with any text, it's always worth exploring some of the context behind the poem before actually studying the poem itself. Although you'll get a good idea of what the poem's about by reading it as an unseen, it's always worth considering what were the inspirations, what gave the writer the idea for this particular poem. And because it's called Poppies, we can't afford to ignore the fact that this is the name of a particular flower. Now, the flower poppy is a wildflower. It grows fairly easily. It sheds its seeds all by itself. You don't have to look after it. And you'll see them popping up in farmers' fields, particularly on traffic islands, alongside the road, anywhere really where there's some spare ground. They'll grow virtually anywhere. And they particularly like churned up land. It's like as if they're really robust seeds and they will kind of challenge themselves to germinate and create roots and start to grow anywhere. And as it says here on the slide, in the First World War, in trench warfare, it was suddenly seen that the more that the ground was being churned up by the constant battles, the shells, the gunfire, and later the tanks that were churning up the mud, and the farmers' fields that were having to be converted into battlefields, not by choice from the farmers, obviously, but just by the context, the situation that they're in. People started noticing that these flowers were appearing. And in particular, this Canadian doctor, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, who was the person responsible for writing the very famous World War I poem In Flanders Field, he noticed the sight of these poppies cropping up on any of these battle-scarred fields, and he started to think of these poppies as being symbolic, a representation of all the lives that had been lost on all sides of war, both enemies and allies. And he penned this particular poem called In Flanders Field. Now, Flanders and Ypres, as it mentions there, are in Belgium. And if you know anything about your history, World War I started in August 1914 and went on until November 1918. And Belgium and France, northern France particularly, suffered terrible losses across their landscape and all of the casualties that were involved. Millions died and many more were injured permanently, physically scarred and incredibly mentally scarred. But this poem is particularly about those who actually were killed as a result of this particular conflict. The first YouTube clip you'll see on your left is a very short film made by the British Legion that explains some of what I've just been talking about. Why is the poppy an internationally recognised symbol of remembrance of all the casualties of war? And in particular, why did the British Legion, the Royal British Legion should I say, adopt it as their emblem? And why do we end up buying them every November to wear for Remembrance Sunday, which is the first Sunday as close as possible to the 11th of November? And we hold our minute silence at 11 a.m. Now, that time and that date is significant because that was the time and date in which the armistice was actually signed and by Germany, and inevitably led to the end of the war and Germany's surrender to the Allies. The two YouTube clips that you can see there as links are both connected to that particular poem. They're worth watching as well as having a look at the poem. It's worth hearing it and seeing how this poem is used as part of our annual traditional commemoration. And the last YouTube clip that I've put on this slide is interesting because I don't know if you know, but 4 or 5 years ago, to commemorate, to mark the centenary of the First World War, a designer decided to actually create these ceramic poppies. And the idea was that every ceramic poppy that was created was going to represent a life of a soldier, a British soldier that had died. And before they were actually auctioned off and sold off to members of the public, whoever wanted one, they were actually displayed at the Tower of London in a really breathtaking display. So that's worth a look, particularly if that's something new to you or it's something that you'd heard of but you'd never actually seen what it actually looked like. And just finally, I just want to share with you, I actually visited northern France and Belgium a few years ago because I have a very distant relative on my father's side who actually died in the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And I always thought, yeah, this Poppies thing, yeah, whatever. And it amazed me at even in 2017 when we made that trip, the farmers' fields all around either side of the road that we were driving on to get to the particular battlefields and the Commonwealth war grave cemeteries where the remains of these soldiers are now being kept sacred and safe, were absolutely covered in poppies. And it was the most beautiful, poignant sight I've ever seen. And then to actually stand in these fields and feel how peaceful they are and how warm and full of nature and birdsong they were at that point, and yet 100 years previous they had been full of bloodshed and death and conflict and loss and chaos and destruction. If you've never been, I would strongly recommend that at some point in your life you do actually visit these battlefields, because it is a trip that will stay with you forever. I'll give you a moment now to have a look at these YouTube clips. See what you think. So don't worry if you don't have your anthology with you, because here's a copy of the poem actually displayed now on this slide. But before you read it, I'd like you to have a look at that YouTube clip that I'm recommending there, which is a short video clip made by the poet Jane Weir herself. And she actually takes you on a journey through the churchyard in Matlock that actually inspired this particular poem. And in the picture there in the middle of the screen, you can see the war memorial in the grounds of St Giles Church in Matlock that she refers to both in her film clip, and also is the war memorial that is referenced in the actual poem itself. Now, although she's not mentioned any names of locations in the poem, she's very clear in this film clip that it is very local, very much about her area and the churchyard and memorial that she is familiar with, and that she often walked around with her own son as a regular kind of little route they used to take. Now, there's no mention of her son actually being involved in the military, so I don't think it's actually autobiographical in that respect, but there are very close connections to her own area and places that she remembers fondly as being locations that she has experience with her nearest and dearest, to her own child, for example. In the top right corner, you'll see an image there of a Commonwealth war grave that's always made, gravestone, sorry, that's always made in this very beautiful white, almost dazzling, especially when the sun shines on it, Portland stone. And this stone was especially commissioned by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the actual authority group, the association that fund all this, because it's so dazzling, because it stands out. Now, if you go to an actual Commonwealth War Grave cemetery, it'll be full of these Portland stone gravestones. But you'll also see these around your own local area if you ever wander into a churchyard or wander into a cemetery. If there is a military person actually buried in that particular churchyard or cemetery, it's very often with a gravestone made out of this Portland stone that has been commissioned by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and it will have their rank and their name and whichever particular battalion or other military group that they actually served with. This particular one, however, in this image was one that myself and my family saw too frequently for our liking when we visited, as I said before, northern France and Belgium, war graves and battlefields in particular in 2017, because this was a stone that could be given to unknown soldiers because nobody actually knew their name. So you'll see on there, all it says is a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. So we don't know who he is because, well, I'll let your imagination work out why they can't identify the body. But God knows who that person was and the duty that they actually gave to both God and country and the sacrifice that they made. Really upsetting to see so many of these actually around. And it's great to have memorials with actual individual names on, but we also have to remember that there were a lot of casualties of war that were never actually found, and we just had to assume that they were dead and killed in action. Have a look at this YouTube clip, see what you think. Okay, just like the other tutorials that you've gone through, we also obviously need to be mindful that we are studying this poem with a view to actually writing about it in an essay in response to an exam question. And in that essay, we will need to actually comment on the writer's craft, how the poet Jane Weir has used form, language, and structure in this poem to convey meaning to the reader. So if you've watched that YouTube clip that I recommended about Jane Weir actually taking you on the journey of the walk through the graveyard up to the memorial and talking about her inspirations for this poem, you'll also have heard her actually reciting the poem standing next to the memorial and in the location that she used as inspiration. I'm going to read it again to you now, and then we're just going to kind of go over what do these things mean. When we get technical, what do we mean by form? What do we mean by structure? What do we mean by language? And what is context? Poppies by Jane Weir. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second, and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me. Skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcement of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. Okay, so form then. Just like with others that we've done, other poems that we've done in these tutorials, form is nothing to get worried about. It's literally just, how has this poem been formed? How many stanzas are there? How many lines per stanza? Is any of this significant? Are we seeing any sort of pattern at all? Can we see any examples of caesura? Can we see any examples of enjambment? Has rhyme been used in any way? Remember, not all poems rhyme. In fact, the majority of them don't rhyme. And sometimes rhyme can actually force you to use words that aren't actually appropriate and aren't the best choices for what you want to say. In terms of structure, it literally just means the order in which the information is presented to you. So how does it begin? What does it develop, go on to in the middle? How does the focus shift towards the end? And how does the poem actually end? And language, any words, any phrases, any maybe lists of words and phrases that you see that particularly grab your attention and create a image in your mind, maybe some pictures. Maybe it's made you think of something that you've seen or something that you've heard. Maybe it's made you sad, made you laugh, made you angry. Okay, this is all about words that actually create an emotional effect in us, make us think, make us feel something. And context is just literally what was happening to actually inspire and influence the writer to put pen to paper and actually create this text. And remember that she is writing this in a graveyard with a war memorial and her own son present. So all these things combine, as she said in that film, to make her try and visualize what might it be like to be the mother of a person who was away at war, potentially putting their life at risk, and worst case scenario, never coming back, actually dying as a result of war. Give some thoughts to those three particular focuses then: form, structure and language, and make your own notes about anything that strikes you as being particularly interesting, particularly significant, and just remember to explain why you've actually chosen that. And don't worry if you think, oh, this is not right. Go with your gut. Okay, whatever you think, so long as you can actually justify it with a clear explanation and evidence from the text, no one can say that you're wrong. It's all open to interpretation. Have a go, see what you come up with. Time for a recap. Well done on working independently and figuring things out for yourself in terms of what you think the poem's about and any of those specific methods used by Jane Weir regarding form, structure and language that you think are significant and have really conveyed to the meaning of this overall poem and the effect it's had on you as a reader. Now, clearly this is written in first person, and as Jane Weir said herself, she was trying to empathise with mothers of military personnel who go off on location and are fighting in conflicts, in wars, possibly all around the world, miles away from home. And what if they never come back? What if sadly they actually die as a result of being in that conflict? So she's written from the perspective of a mother. So this is very different to Simon Armitage's poem Remains, which was written, as you know, from the perspective of a soldier actually in the conflict, experiencing it themselves and trying to deal with the guilt of having caused the death of a person and not knowing. That's what really gets to that particular character, not knowing whether that killing was justified or not. Was that looter armed or not? And that's why that phrase is repeated, because that's the crux of his problem. This poem, Poppies, is very different again from War Photographer, because that was, again, taken from the perspective of somebody actually on the front line, but not from a soldier, but from somebody who works alongside those soldiers, actually reporting and recording these conflicts as they happen. So essentially having the same experience, but not actually doing any killing themselves. But certainly they are putting themselves at risk for the good of the job that they have to do. They feel they have to report and record what's going on and tell that truth to other countries in the world that aren't part of that conflict and may not understand. The other poem, Kamikaze, I think is similar to this one, more so than Remains and War Photographer, because Kamikaze, if you remember from that tutorial, is told from the point of view of a family member. And that's exactly what Poppies is like. This is also told from a family member. So in Kamikaze, if you remember, that is told from the perspective of the daughter of the pilot who had been selected for his special mission, his special attack mission for a kamikaze mission, but had for some reason decided not to actually go through with it. And I have to say for some reason, because the daughter who is the voice in that poem doesn't know. Because if you remember, when the guy returns after the aborted mission, he's thinking everyone's going to be over the moon to see him. Thank goodness he didn't actually die in that suicide special attack mission. But they don't. Nobody acknowledges him in that village, not even his own wife, the speaker's mother. So it's almost like he's died anyway. And that last line, if you remember, which would be the better way to die, is really poignant, because although he didn't die literally, because he didn't carry out his suicide mission, he died metaphorically because everyone treated him as a non-person. And because the daughter never got the chance to actually speak clearly and directly with her father about his experience and ask him outright to explain why didn't he do it, that poem is full of speculation. And that's why I think it's very similar to Poppies, because again, we've got this experience being told from the perspective of a family member. So not somebody who's actually experiencing conflict directly themselves, but somebody who's having to speculate on things that they don't know. Speculate on worst case scenarios. And that's what this mother is about. And you know, all mothers worry. It doesn't matter whether you're the mother of a newborn baby or you're the mother of a 70-year-old. Yeah, if you're lucky enough to still be alive when your child is 70, you will always worry about them. You will always be their mother, their carer, if you like, even whether, even when they've left home and they no longer live with you. And this poem at the beginning establishes that care, that pride that the mother has. But straight away, she doesn't go straight into actually talking about the child. She's immediately making that connection with Armistice Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, and the poppies that we wear to commemorate the war dead. So we know immediately from that opening sentence that is her biggest fear on her mind. She thinks that this might be the last time she sees her child alive. And I'm calling the person a child because we don't actually know their gender. We don't know whether it's a son. We don't know whether it's a daughter. But I don't want you to think of it as being a child as in somebody young. It's obviously somebody who's already old enough to be able to join the military. And that's how I see this poem as being. But because it's told from the perspective of a mother, no matter how old you are, your mother will always see you as being a child, being innocent, being vulnerable, somebody who she needs to look after and protect and take care of, because that's been her role since the day you were conceived, let alone from the day you were born. So immediately from this opening sentence, we get the impression that this mother is terrified of her child dying. But she can't say that. She can't actually voice that. She's trying to keep it all in, which is what makes her feel even worse. In the second sentence, we get the context: before you left. So we are privy here, we're being invited in to this very sentimental, very poignant moment between mother and child, when she actually says goodbye at the door to her child who's going off on this new adventure, this next stage in their life. And it's 3 days before Armistice Sunday, so it's obviously November time. And because they're going off, as we all do, they'll be wearing a poppy. But on this particular occasion, they're going off wearing a blazer, something smart. Yeah, formal wear. A blazer is like a suit jacket. So it's not necessarily military uniform, but it could be, right? But she's called it a blazer, a smart suit jacket. So again, that could be male or female. We really can't tell for sure. But the way she describes this poem: crimped, spasms, red, blockade, disrupting, it almost binding as well. It almost reminds me there of conflict, of death. And that's why I've put under language semantic field of conflict. Because a blockade is something that gets put up when the barriers are put up, when there are areas of conflict and places are actually divided by enemy lines. And spasms are when your body is uncontrollable. It goes into spasms, it goes into shock, maybe convulsions. And it's an odd way to describe a paper poppy. But it's clearly the way that she's thinking. She's worried sick that her child is going to come to some harm when they go off and join the military, wherever they're going. So everything that she's doing, everything that she's seeing and hearing is being influenced by this worst case scenario, this deep rooted fear she has that she will not see her child alive again. But she carries on in the second stanza. She carries on doing that mum bit, that taking care, that making sure they're as smart as possible, even to the point where she's picking off all the cat hairs and smoothing down the collar and making sure that this child is as smart as anything as they leave the house. Remember back to maybe your first day at school, whether that be primary school or again your first day at secondary school, and perhaps your mum made a big fuss of your uniform, and mum and maybe dad as well took your picture because they were so proud of seeing you in your pristine new school uniform. That's what I'm reminded of here. And maybe in her mind, in the mother's mind, she's been transported back to that very moment, and she sees this as, the next stage in her child's development, in her child's life. This child is now going off, and she just wants to make sure that she's sending him or her off in the best way possible so that she's done her job as mother. And we're reminded again of the mother wanting to do cute things and treat this adult as a child still, when she talks about that Eskimo kiss that they used to do when they used to graze noses with each other. And she also wants to muss up the child's hair, which has got gel on it, and it's been done in a specific style. And I'm like that with my own kids, and they'll go, "Oh, mom, get off me! Stop messing. I've just done all that. Leave me alone." And it's something you can't resist as a mother, and no doubt your mother does some similar things to you, and it irritates you, but it's just a way to show affection. And so it's nothing we should criticize moms for, but it's us trying to assert ourselves as being independent, isn't it? We're not a child anymore, mum. We're an adult, so please treat us like that. but she is reminded of when he or she was much younger, and she used to have to do all these things for them, and doesn't really want to let go of having to have that role, that duty of looking after the child, but knows ultimately that she is going to have to let go because the child is leaving home. I wonder actually whether those black thorns that are mentioned there, again, it's an interesting and unusual way of describing somebody's hair. And you might think I'm stretching this symbolism a little bit, but I'm reminded of Jesus here and the crown of thorns that he was forced to wear before he was crucified. And maybe Weir is making a connection there, because according to the Bible, Jesus was sacrificed for the good of everybody else. He died so the rest of us, the rest of mankind, could prosper and survive and be better people. And the sad fact is that the people in our military do put themselves at risk and do sometimes end up sacrificing themselves for the greater good, to achieve peace, to achieve success in a war, and stop that war happening anymore, and prevent any further casualties. So if as I said before, there's nothing that can be criticized if you've explained yourself and you've used evidence from the poem, and your explanation is clear so that somebody else can, read it and think, yeah, I can see that. Even if it feels like you're stretching it a bit, and you're kind of saying things that really don't make a lot of sense, you can make them make sense. Okay, and that's a good example of that. So maybe not everybody agrees with me, but I can see that, and hopefully I've explained it clearly to you. In the film clip that Jane Weir did herself, that I advise you to look at earlier in this slideshow, she talked about when she refers to felt in line 17. And the way that felt is actually made is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of different fabrics, all squashed together, and that are then stretched and turned into this more combined fluffy fabric. And she's referring there to her words that felt like they were all being squeezed together and layered one on top of the other, and mushed together, if you like, into this felt. I think what she's getting at there is not necessarily the words that she's speaking out loud, but the words that she really is desperate to say out loud, but daren't. One, because she doesn't want to worry her child, and two, because she wants to stay strong. She wants to share in her child's excitement of leaving home and starting this new adventure, this new next stage in their development, their independence. So she doesn't want to rain on their parade, make them feel bad about it. They shouldn't feel bad about it. If this is what they want to do, they should be allowed to do it. As parents, we have to accept that our children are going to leave home at some point. They are going to want to do things that maybe we don't always agree with, but they have to do it. Everyone has to learn by their own experiences. But that is hard. So not only does she use these figurative ways of expressing herself in language, things that figurative language is your similes, your metaphors, your personification, that kind of thing, things that aren't to be taken literally. They're meant to be using things that are being compared to, images that make you think about what is the intensity of what's being described here. And because Jane Weir is a textile designer, it makes sense to her to use textile and dressmaking references to describe the mother and how this mother's feeling. But also the enjambment here does that, doesn't it? And I've mentioned there under form, lines 17 to 18, having that deliberate break over the two stanzas really does emphasize that emotional struggle. So she's squashing all these words that she can't say out loud into this ball of felt, but even that starts to melt. She's burying it all inside, and we know from reading remains how difficult, how damaging it can be to bury your feelings all inside. But we also appreciate why this mother feels that she has to keep it all inside at this point in time. And she reinforces that, doesn't she, by saying, I was brave. Yeah, I did my duty. I kept it all in. I didn't show you how traumatized I was by this experience. I walked with you to the front door and even threw it open for you to show you just how proud I was of you and how much excitement I was also feeling alongside you. But inside, I was struggling. But I couldn't share that with you. When you look at it like that, it makes you feel really sorry for this mum, because she is being torn in two by what's happening. I do love this simile, though, of the world overflowing like a treasure chest. Now, that's mum accepting that the world is going to be full of excitement and adventure for her child as he or she steps out to take on the next stage of their life. But also it gives you an idea of how the child's seeing this next stage of their life as well. They are going to experience such excitement, such dazzling sights, such marvelous sounds, things that they've never done before. And then they can't wait. Hence why a split second and they've gone. They're intoxicated by it all. They're so immersed in their excitement of starting this new adventure that they forget that poor old mum's behind them, and he's crushed by it all. But that's okay. That's what happens. And mums and dads have been going through this for generations, so that they just accept it. The Volta here then, I think, appears in line 23 when the child's gone and the mum's left on her own. So after you'd gone, I went into your bedroom. Now that makes sense. They want to be as close as possible to their child again, even though their child is no longer physically there. The bedroom is going to be the space that this person found most personal. So they go into the bedroom and release a songbird from its cage. And again, look at that symbolism. Yeah, mothers letting go of children to allow them to grow up is like releasing a songbird from its cage. The family home was the cage with all the rules and regulations and things that you're under my roof, you have to do as you're told. And once you leave home, it does feel like you're being released, and you can sing your own song. You can be your own person and have that independence. But it's hard for the parents to be able to do that. We've also got symbolism mentioned in line 25 of the single dove. That's an internationally recognised symbol of peace, isn't it? So she sees this single dove, just says later. Yeah, it doesn't really matter how much time she spent in that bedroom, it just says later. But later she saw this single dove, and again she's reminded of calm and peace. But also it could be, but that comes after conflict, after chaos, after destruction. So she perhaps goes back to what she was frightened of from the very beginning of the poem. The fact that one day her child might actually have a war grave of their own. And she might be wearing a poppy specifically to remember her own child, not just all the other unknown, strangers that have fallen in war, like the majority of us do. So she follows this single dove, and it flies in the direction of the churchyard. And as she's walking through the churchyard and seeing graves, understandably, her stomach's churning. It's busy, making tucks, darts, pleats. And that in itself is that kind of, when your stomach churns, when you're really anxious, when you're really worried about something, you almost feel like you're going to be sick, you're going to vomit, because you're so unsettled. But because of her textile and dressmaking background, I find it interesting that she uses tucks, darts, and pleats, which are always kind of things that go over something else and are trying to attach, trying to make something one, but could all easily be torn as well. So again, it emphasizes just how worried and anxious this mother's feeling. When she gets to the top of the hill, she sees the war memorial and starts to trace the inscriptions. Now, I imagine she's perhaps got her finger on the inscriptions and is just going over them and trying to empathize, like Jane Weir said in the video, trying to empathize with the mothers of these soldiers whose names are on this war memorial. And when she says lean against it like a wishbone, I think she's saying there, please, God, do not let my child's name appear on this war memorial. Please bring him or her safe home to me. Now, some people who read this poem actually read it as there's been a massive amount of time passed by and the child has actually died in war and their name is on the war memorial. Personally, I don't see it like that. I see it as she's making a wish there that, you know, I'm really sad, I'm really sorry for all the names on here, but please, God, do not make it so that my child's name appears on here. I do not want my child to die as a result of war. To me, that makes more sense. I can see where these other interpretations come from, but to me, this is all happening in one day, all on the day, the significant day when the child actually left home. Seeing the dove pulling freely against the sky, doing an ornamental stitch, to me is just maybe almost kind of making that international symbol in the sky, just as a permanent reminder of there is peace in my sky, there is peace in a lot of the areas of the world, and there will be peace eventually for everybody. It's just a nice way of kind of, I guess, realizing that there is war, there is peace, but peace is what we're all aiming for. And that's perhaps why the child wanted to join the military in the first place, because they wanted to make a difference. They wanted to bring peace to the world. So she's acknowledging that. It's an ornamental stitch. It's decorative. It's something to be proud of. But that last sentence, I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind, is a reminder that no matter how old this child is, no matter how independent, how tough they are, to her, they're still a child. And she can't wait to hear their voice again and to see them again. And so to please God, I'm begging you, I'm wishing now, make sure they come back safe to me. Personally, I like this poem. I think it's very sentimental. It's not gushy, but she makes it really clear for me how mothers must feel when they are saying goodbye to their children, leaving home to go to experience God knows what, God knows where, and put themselves at risk. It is chronological in its structure. Although there are flashbacks to childhood memories and flash forwards to thoughts of worst case scenario, but for me it feels like, as I've said before, it's that day and what happens that day, the day of significance when the child first leaves home. In terms of the form, we've talked about enjambment. I've also referenced there about caesura. There are a few examples of caesura actually, and it would be worth you going back over the poem if it wasn't something that you'd spotted when you did this independently. Now I've explained a few and I've mentioned a couple of examples there. Have a look yourself and have a go at writing your own explanations as to why caesura is significant and how does the use of caesura help to allow the reader to understand what the writer's getting at. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope that you come back to it and listen to it many times again in the future, especially when you're revising for your final exams. Do add to your notes that you'd made independently. Have a look at the poem again. Have a look again at the specific methods, and maybe you're seeing something else in the language, something else in the form, something else in the structure, now that you've heard me talk about it and give my own interpretation of this. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.